And one of the hopes is about the contest today. I was there. It's right now. So because it's just like there's this is yes. So it's so I've been just that's a name. So I could I have great lists because it's just a song about I have
Good afternoon. For those joining from home, we'll be starting shortly. Thanks.
Because I called him last night, you're right there. It was fine. So small caravan, right? Stop there. That's the right. I called him. I do something kids on it. I just raised a very big vibe. That's very. It's in the 60s. I just. Here. Yes. So this is I just. Yeah, it's kind of good. So he's he has a choice.
Colin, you ready? Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to those joining from home to the third lecture in our 2025-2026 lecture series, Revisiting the American Revolution, Part 2. This is a good time to ask you to please silence your cell phones. And we are joined by a bunch of folks at home, and we're just thrilled to see so many of you out and during this busy time of year. My name is Deirdre Anderson. I serve as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society, and it's truly an honor to share this series with such a loyal and engaged community. Before we begin, some programming notes. Our new exhibition, Witness Hingham in the Age of Revolution, 1760 to 1781, is on view Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We encourage you to make visiting Witness part of your holiday plans. When you just need a break from some of the consumption and you need to see beauty and be reminded of the role Hingham played, we invite you to please come join us here at the museum. And with some advance notice, we're happy to serve you and your friends a cup of tea, glass of wine, beer, whatever suits your fancy. This coming Saturday, December 13th, the Hingham Historical Society is sponsoring downtown Hingham's horse-drawn carriage rides. So if you have a young person in your life or want to feel young at heart and enjoy the magic of the season, please join us for a spin around the square from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. We'll be joined by some historical characters. On Tuesday, December 16th, please join us at the Hingham Community Center for the annual menorah lighting at 5 p.m. as we welcome the light of Hanukkah together. And looking ahead to January 2026, we have the following dates for you. Member After Hours on Thursday, January 15th at 5:30 with Jerry Duff, sharing images and stories from Hingham fires over the decades. On January 25th at 3, that's a Sunday, that's the next lecture in this series with Lucia Abramovich Sanchez of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And Lucia is going to give us an overview of the 8 galleries that the MFA is recurating for America's 250th. Finally, a brief note of thanks. Many of you joined us last month for our screenings of The American Revolution by Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David Schmidt. We hope the documentary deepened your appreciation for the work we do together here to preserve and share Hingham's revolutionary history. As we approach year end, I ask for your philanthropic support. As a nonprofit, everything we offer, the ability to open and staff our beautiful museum for 500 visitors during Friday night's Christmas in the Square. You'll be getting a photograph from me, which will warm your heart because it was lined strollers all the way up, all the way up our driveway. And if you're worried about the next generation coming in and seeing these beautiful spaces, take heart that because of your generosity, we keep the lights on and programs like this lecture series, Friday night, school partnerships, the full slate of 2026 commemorative events we have planned is possible because of your generosity. So thank you. You should have received our annual appeal in the mail, and we'll remind you by email. But again, my heartfelt thanks. Without your support, none of this happens. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you to our board member and member of our programs committee, who will introduce today's speaker, Scott McGilvery. Scott?
Thank you, Deirdre. Our speaker today is Meg Muckenhoupt, and she writes about food, landscapes, and history. Her work has been featured in the Boston Globe, Boston Magazine, the New York Times, The Wirecutter, USA Today's Reviewed.com, and she's been featured on NPR's Radio Boston and WCVB's Chronicle, as well as WGBH's Forum. If you can get through all that, that's impressive. Her published book titles include The Truth About Baked Beans, An Edible History of New England, Cabbage, A Global History, and her book, Boston Gardens and Green Spaces, is a Boston Globe local bestseller. She lives in Metro West and earlier today toured not only the kitchen at Old Ordinary, but the dairy at the Benjamin Lincoln House, which is awesome. And so please join me in welcoming Meg to Hingham. Thanks, Meg.
Hello, and thank you for having me. And I must say that the cheese and the dairy looked very hard. You know, you wouldn't want to try to biting into that. Welcome. So glad to be here. I'm not a food historian per se. My name is Meg Muckenhoupt. I write about things that are interesting to me. When I have a question I can't answer, I start researching it. And then, you know, a couple hundred pages later, I figure out, oh, I've written a book about this. Maybe I should try to publish it. What we're going to talk about today is not entirely about colonial food per se, but how do we think about food and our past? The title of this talk is Tasting History, and that's an interesting question. Can you taste history? Is it even possible? But I'm going to be talking a little bit about our actual taste buds. I'm going to be talking about how we think about food and history and who ate that food and how do we know what they ate and what they thought about it. And how do we think about this in the future? Next slide, please. Okay. So when I first thought about the title of this talk, I thought you're not serious about tasting history, because there are all sorts of problems when you think about tasting history. Things have changed a little bit since the 1770s here. And I'm just going to list a few things that have changed. One of them is your tongue probably itself. I'll talk about that more in moments. Like, none of your tongues actually existed back then. Even though this may be an older crowd, you're not that old. Your teeth, how many of them you have in your mouth at any given time. What is considered appropriate food? And what food is available to you. For example, when I was in the bathroom a little bit earlier, powdering my nose, of course, I saw an illustration which actually of a buckeye, but it reminded me of the American chestnut. Chestnuts roasting by an open fire. You're not doing that now because we don't have chestnut trees in the Northeast anymore, except those provided by the American Chestnut Project because of a blight that came in about 1910 and decimated about a quarter of our trees in our Northeastern deciduous forests. This was an extremely common food. If you look at novels in the 19th century, they're constantly talking about chestnut wood and girls with chestnut colored hair, which was not purple. And that's just not a touchstone. That's not a taste touchstone. You can buy chestnuts on the streets of New York still roasted, but they're not American chestnuts. They're a different species from a different place. And so that's a taste, that's a food that's just not available to us in any form at all right now. In some cultures, some foods are considered edible, and some cultures, those same foods are considered absolutely disgusting. Cheese. I mean, even when it's not hard from sitting in the dairy for the past 200 years, it's rotted milk from a cow. That's a very strange idea. Some cultures eat silkworms or other insects. Some Scotsmen eat oats, which we know are only fit for horses here in New England. So what is considered food and what isn't food changes depending on where you are and what time you are. How your food is cooked, how it's served changes its taste, its texture, and what different dishes are available. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when we see a picture of the Hingham kitchen here. How your food is grown. Where is it grown? Are you getting fresh strawberries from Belmont, Massachusetts, which had award-winning strawberries back in the day? Or are you getting them from Florida on a train from a few days earlier? Or are you getting them from California on an airplane? That changes the texture, changes the food itself. How you select your food. Are you pulling it out of your ground? Are you getting it from a can, from a cannery in Maine that advertises the best baked beans ever, which may not ever have been baked? They may be coming from a kettle and put in a pan. That changes what food is available, what the taste is, what you expect things to taste like. And then once you actually taste something, your emotion to it, your reaction. Is this good? Is this bad? Is it like the stuff you had growing up? Is it some of that newfangled thing that you don't like very much? Is it something that somebody like you is supposed to eat? So there's lots of different factors when we think about tastes and history and whether we can actually contact that again. Next slide, please. At the same time, we taste history in every bite because what food is available to you is a product of wars, of tariffs, of decisions people made 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 150 years ago about what was going to be available now. The diet of New England changed dramatically when the Erie Canal went in and suddenly wheat became extremely cheap. The growers of corn in New England were not happy about this. Cornbread ceased to be a New England thing in a lot of ways, except for those little muffins that they had at Durgan Park for a long time. It wasn't an everyday food in the way it continued to be in the South because it was just cheaper and easier to get that wheat from upstate New York that came in so easily on the canal and then the railroad. It changed what we think of as New England food. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a headline from 2018, but it helps explain why I wrote a book about baked beans in the first place, because it's kind of a niche thing. We don't have like Baked Bean Magazine. They don't have Baked Bean Boss, the Great British Bean Off. It just is not happening out there culturally. But just to explain, although my family is from New England historically, I have an ancestor that arrived here in 1630 at the age of 17 and never saw his parents again. But survived to have his own children who, I don't know if they visited him when they grow up either. You don't hear these things. I was raised in New Jersey, so a lot about how New England people talk and think about food was a little bit odd to me. I grew up surrounded by things like pizza and bagels that you can actually chew that aren't just like Wonder Bread in a torus shape. And when I had baked beans up here for the first time, it was kind of puzzling to me, like, who thought of putting molasses in this stuff? Where did that idea come from? And it just sort of nagged at me over time. So I was thinking about what is New England food? What is it? There are restaurants that serve food from New England. There was Durgan Park, which has since closed. Of course, I will note that they closed after they started serving entrees like Coca-Cola ribs, which is just odd for something that's supposed to be Durgan Park. It seemed like a lot of things that a lot of people weren't really eating all that much. Everybody loves clam chowder. Sure, the corn muffins, they were yummy and sweet. Baked beans, people seem to like a lot. But other things like Indian pudding is not an everyday food. You can't get it at a gas station the way you can something like a whoopie pie. There isn't like an aisle at market baskets saying Indian pudding 4 different ways with, maybe the barbecue flavor or the salt. It was very puzzling to me. So I started investigating, okay, where did the molasses idea of savory dish come from in New England? And from that, I kept on encountering lots of strange ideas and I was trying to trace back where this came from. So what I'm going to talk about today in terms of taste and our history and the Revolutionary War is the flavor of sweetness. What did this mean back then? How has it changed from then until now? How does our conception of colonial food include the sweet? And is that right or is it wrong? Next slide. Okay, this is your tongue. I like this slide because I'm able to talk about a myth of culinary psychology, and I have a master's in psychology, so I like to drag this out whenever I can. In 1901, there was a paper published in German, which was, of course, the educated language of psychology at that time, where a guy took different concentrations of sugar water and basically put them on people's tongues over and over and over again and made a map of where the tongue was most sensitive. But what that was translated to by Americans who were kind of sloppy said, oh, yeah, you can only taste sweet at the tip of your tongue. This is just wrong. Okay. If you grew up with that map of you taste sweet here and bitter back there, it's wrong. You can taste everything all over your tongue. Your tongue is a very active and happy to taste things. It's just a little bit more sensitive in the front. One of the factors when you think about tasting history is what is the environment surrounding your tongue and what is in the air. Some of you have done your that elementary school experiment like, let's make Joe eat onions by having him hold his nose and tell him that it's apples. Has anybody done that? Done the apple? Okay. Next time you have onions and you want to eat a lot of them at the time, maybe as a health thing, I don't know, do they help with colds? Hold your nose. And the onion tastes very different when you can't breathe in the smell of the onion. It tastes mildly sweet and sort of crunchy like an apple. The environment around people in colonial times when they were eating indoors was very different from now because, of course, you were heating primarily with wood, with smoke. Some of you may have been multi-pack-a-day smokers in the past. You may remember that people talked a lot about how your taste isn't as acute when you've been smoking a lot, when your nasal passages are full of all that, what were the words? Not char, not soot. There's another word for what cigarettes put inside your lungs back in the day. Anyway, not nicotine. There was another word for the parts of this. Tar. Yes, tar. It's a good New England piratey kind of word. But just what you put on a barrel, right? Or a bucket. You put tar around to make it put together. Being in that environment affects what you can taste. It affects how you taste it. It affects the smell of the food. The smoking off of something put over wood fire is very different from something that's baked in an oven. So that affects your sense of taste, just what is around you. It's not just the food, it's the environment of the air. And, do you feel good today? Do you have a cold? Do you have some sort of catarrh? Also affects your taste. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a fun little graph. This was prepared by a science writer about 10 years ago named Steve Guyanet with the heading, "The American diet will consist entirely of sugar by 2606. Okay, so part of the problem with our tongues today is that our tongues are used to having a lot more sweetness in our diet than was available in the 1770s or 1620s. You should take this graph from a grain of salt because I suspect, though I'm not entirely certain, that this was derived from consumption statistics about how much sugar is available in your environment. And some of that sugar is being used to produce things like ethanol. It's being fed to cattle. It's being used to produce other sorts of alcohol. So people are not actually eating 120 pounds of sugar per day per person in the United States. You would know that. You would be having your sugar ration of a half pound to just toss down your mouth every day. But people are eating on the order of about 3 ounces of sugar per day in the United States. If you look at when people actually record their diet, how much is actually going in their mouths. Some people are having a lot more, some people are having a lot less. But the main thing to take away here is we're having a lot of sweetness in our life. We expect things to be sweet. We sweeten a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be sweet in other times, like yogurt. You know, if you were eating yogurt 250 years ago, which was not in the United States, that's just the thing that came to my mind. You would not expect it to have sugar in it. Next slide. Here's just another slide of the same trend. The nice thing I like about this is it points out sometimes when sugar increased and sugar didn't. It doesn't go back as far in history, but you can see things like during Prohibition, a lot of soda shops set up and people were eating a lot more sugar directly. During World War II, there were sugar rations that were being cut. People consumed a lot less sugar over time. Apparently the Surgeon General in 2001 mentioned that people were getting a little bit tubby in the United States and people stopped eating quite as much sugar then, but still a lot more than you would have had before 1920 or so. And just a note here, when I talk about the problem of figuring how much sugar people eat from looking at just how much is available industrially, like if you look at United States Department of Commerce reports, it's a problem for culinary historians to figure out what people were actually eating at any given time in history. Specifically, before there were social service agencies set up, some of the dietaries we have, the information we have about how much sugar, how much grain, how much meat people had in their diet are basically from social workers working in different populations. We have them from 1912 in Lowell, looking at the different workers in the mills, and I'll be showing that a little bit later. We have them from the early 1840s, before the famine in Ireland, when basically social workers from England were coming over and seeing what an average laborer would eat. And the answer to that is a lot of potatoes. I'm just mentioning this because we have had so much Irish immigration to this area of the country. Folks working on farms in rural Ireland in 1840 were literally eating 10 to 15 pounds of potatoes a day with maybe a pint of buttermilk or maybe some herring to supplement their diet. And that is just, they were healthy. They were able to work. They were able to raise children. But that is just a lot of potatoes. And we know that because people were going around tracking them, what they did. During the Revolutionary era, during 1800, there wasn't necessarily somebody going around recording that. The records that we do have are things like how much food is being served in prisons, how much food is being served in orphanages, what sort of food was being served to the troops during the colonial war. But that isn't necessarily what people ate at home. That isn't necessarily what people would have liked to eat. That isn't necessarily the taste that people enjoyed. That was the food that was being provided to them at the time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So bringing us back to sugar. You saw that there are some graphs showing that sugar consumption increased over time. It seems to have followed the price of sugar, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I just love this quote from 1635 when Roger Williams wrote to John Winthrop, the Massachusetts Bay governor, concerning a Narragansett chief named Canonicus, that Canonicus would gladly accept a box of 8 or 10 pounds of sugar, and he would thank Mr. Governor for a box full. So when we're talking about the availability of sugar in the early post-European colonial period, we're talking about a place where there wasn't a lot of sweet materials in New England. Sugar was so valuable that just having basically 2 bags you could buy at Market Basket, was considered a great gift, something you would ask the governor of your colony for as a special treat. And again, you can buy it for less than $5 at Market Basket today. In 1650, the price of sugar in England was about 25 pence a pound. And remember, at that time, the Barbados sugar colonies weren't really up and going and pumping out the sugar like they were a couple of decades later. So any sugar that was coming to the US would have had to go to London and then get shipped back because they didn't have those direct shipping routes cut up. So it was 25 pence a pound. That's about 1/400th of a typical family income in London at the time. If you want to talk about 1/400th of, let's say a typical American family makes $50,000 a year today, you're talking about $125 a pound for this stuff. This is why people weren't, putting sugar in their tea in 1650 in New England. It was just that expensive. Next slide. I will also note that in the earliest days of Republic, they didn't have access to honey either very often because honeybees are not native to North America. So before European contact in New England, there weren't that many options for sweetening. And I like putting up this picture of a skep because you have the first probate record of bees dates from 1630. And those bees would have had to come to our continent by boat. On a journey that takes about 6 weeks, you're stuck on a wooden boat going up and down in the ocean with somewhere down in the hold, there's this hive and it's full of bees and they are not happy. But somebody took that risk because sugar and sweetness was that important. But, it's not like there was a giant honey factory around. They were useful, but this was not a large-scale industry the way that sugar came to be in the Caribbean plantations. Next slide. Okay, but you say, oh, but we had maple syrup, and that made everything sweet and lovely in New England. Well, remember how I said a moment ago that it's hard to figure out what people ate? Okay. So the problem with figuring out how much maple syrup there was in New England before European contact is that the Europeans had contacted everything around here. Massachusetts basically only has a couple of different little stands of old growth forest that you can find in the Mohawk Trail National Forest, because basically every other place in Massachusetts has been logged, has been farmed, has had somebody going in and messing around with it. Most of the archaeological sites in New England where we can find information about practices by Wampanoag and people who came before them have been disrupted in some way. It's really hard to find old cooking vessels that have any residue on them that we could scrape off to see what's in them. And so far, archaeologists haven't found any trace of maple syrup being boiled down in those vessels. There's a lot of controversy about exactly when people started boiling down maple syrup in New England and how old a practice this is. Europeans didn't do this back in the old country, although you can make maple syrup from European maples too. They're all maples. You can make maple syrup from any maple you want. You could even do those stupid Norway maples that, invade all of our forests, but they have a much higher ratio of how much you have to boil down the sap to get maple syrup out of it. It just takes a lot of fuel and doesn't necessarily taste as good. And the maple syrup industry seems to have really taken off in New England to the extent that European colonists recorded it, which is not the same thing as necessarily being reality, but where we have written record. After a lot of people were driven out of Barbados when the sugar industry consolidated, between 1650 and 1660, a lot of the smaller farmers who were trying to make a go of sugarcane were basically bought out or driven out of business. And a lot of them immigrated to New England with a lot of knowledge about how to take a sweet liquid and boil it down into something concentrated. We know that peoples living in New England and southern Quebec definitely knew that the sap of maple trees was sweet. Before European contact, there's records of French missionaries talking about that sweet wine, like Malaga wine that came out of the maple trees that various Mi'kmaq had showed them. But it's not really clear that it was made into syrup, which is a pain to store, even though it's lovely. You tip it over like, oh my God, I just spent $10 on that maple syrup and now it's all over the floor. Some of us have yelled at children because of this. Not like Mrs. Butterworth, where it's like, oh, that's 2 cents. Nobody cares. So It's not really clear how much maple syrup was around in our early republic or how much it had. By the time of the Revolution, it wasn't all that popular because the price of sugar had fallen, and it was seen as being kind of a backwoods thing. You're like, oh, that's something those farmers up in Vermont make. If you're really fashionable, you'll just have white sugar. You won't have that polluted stuff from a farm. There's a lot about New England food and attitudes towards foods that have to do with differentiating yourself from those people on the farm versus us sophisticated city people who can get things from the ports. Next slide. Oh. Why do we have maple syrup today in New England if people were eschewing it as being too primitive for civilized people? There are two good reasons for this. One of them is that sheep. I love that sheep. You don't make sheep like that. No, we do make sheep like this anymore. This is a merino sheep. Between 1810 and 1840, there were a lot of sheep being raised in New England to make merino wool. There was a craze. People got a bounty, sort of an extra money for selling wool from these sheep. And you know what you need to feed sheep? A lot of grass. Where do you get grass? Well, if you don't have it, just chop down a tree. You can get more grass. This is what happens to Vermont hillsides between 1810 and 1840. You get about 70% of the forested hillsides having the forest chopped down to make more pasture for these sheep. After that, the price bottomed out, but Vermont was still left with a lot of hillsides that didn't have their pine trees on it anymore, or their spruce, or their conifers that made the forest. And over time, things started growing up again. The mix of what was available in New England changed, and the next crop was those maple trees that you saw in the previous slide. If you were in Vermont in 1650, you wouldn't be making much maple syrup because there wouldn't be that many maple trees around. Now we have hundreds and thousands of them, as long as climate change doesn't kill them all. But, that'll take some time. The other reason that we have maple syrup, and it's such a big deal in New England, has to do with the Civil War. When the Civil War was going on, we couldn't get imports of sugar from Louisiana. We were basically cut off from other sugar supplies, and people looked to what was available in New England, and we had maple syrup. People discovered that they kind of liked it, and it was once again readopted. It had an image of sort of purity as opposed to being low class like those farmers. The taste hadn't changed, but the idea of whether it was appropriate for us, whether it reflected well on us as a food had changed. It became much more popular, and it's stayed basically a staple of our New England diet identity since then. Next slide. Okay. One other problem with tasting history is that different groups of people in history ate really different diets, just like today. Again, if you go to Market Basket, there may be entire aisles of food that you never visit, and you don't know why somebody would buy that stuff. Well, happened back then too. This is an excavation of the African Meeting House in Boston, Massachusetts. This was a study of it published in 2007. They went and excavated privies that were used between about 1800 and 1840 there. Basically places where people pooped, but also you want to get rid of something, you just throw it down the hole. And they found lots of traces of what people ate. A lot of it was sort of a typical diet. They'd have some pork bones, they'd have some beef bones, they had some shells and things like that. But they also found a couple of interesting things. They found a lot of pork trotters, and they found some bones from snapping turtles, which were eaten much more commonly in mid-Atlantic, go down to Maryland or so. People would be having their turtle soup much more often. Not so common up in Boston, except among the free African-American community that was living around this meeting house. So again, it's a different set of what foods are considered special, because some of this may have been from celebrations. There was a very famous caterer who lived there, was probably preparing food for the African-American community in Boston at that time. It would have thrown bones down this privy. Different expectations about what you eat when, and what animals you eat, and what is considered special or something you serve to guests. Again, that affects how you think about taste. Next slide, please. Okay, anybody recognize this? It's Jaws. No, this is the cod from the State House. And actually, this projection, this is almost life size. Let me see, 6 feet. Yeah, I'm about 5'6". Yeah, it's about the right size. When I talk about different communities eating different foods, one of them is who ate codfish during the time of the Revolution and before the Revolution. You know, you've heard that, oh, to Boston, the land of the beans and the cod, where the Cabots speak only to Lowells and the Lowells speak only to God. I'm not going to tell you the little limerick about the musical fruit. I'm sure you already know that one. We're famous for cod. Cod has made fortunes over and over again in Boston, but how did they do that? Because it wasn't necessarily Paul Revere going off and, buying a couple thousand tons of codfish every day to feed his apprentices. Who was eating that cod? A lot of it was exported. It was exported as salt cod. So, again, how many of you have had salt cod like in the past week? Has anybody? Has anybody tried to work with salt cod? You know what you have to soak it for a really long time, and then you chop it up and make cod cakes or whatever you do with that. It's kind of, by modern standards of food preparation, salt cod is a pain. You can't just put it in the microwave and have something to eat. Okay, you can't just shake it out of your box of salt cod flakes and spoon them up with milk or anything like that. It was valuable because you could salt it. It had a very low fat ratio, so it was basically pure protein. It's salted. It kept really well, partly because it becomes hard as a rock, almost as hard as that cheese in the dairy I was talking about there. And it was shipped very far away. Some of it went to Europe for people who were fasting on Fridays, to those Catholic nations. But a lot of it went to the Caribbean. A lot of it went to plantations where people were enslaved, where people didn't have a choice about what they ate. And also where they didn't necessarily have an opportunity to grow or produce their own food because the land was so valuable for sugar production that the owners of the plantations didn't want to have anybody having their own plots of land. They didn't want to grow any corn, any peas, any cows. No, we're just going to import it all because the sugar we can grow on the land is more valuable than any food you can have to feed you. So a lot of the salt cod that was shipped to the West Indies was the stuff you couldn't sell in the European market because, frankly, the owners just wanted food they could get for cheap. So it may have been sort of brown. It may have been kind of cracked and broken up and things like that. It may have been a little bit smellier than the typical cod. And we know this because, again, we can see registers of how much was imported by the various states and that there was a lot of cod going to these sugar places. Yeah. Ackee, fish, and rice. I'm trying to remember how the Jamaica Farewell song goes. You can still hear about the salt fish, the salt cod, the tradition that started during those times being eaten in various places in the Caribbean. Next slide. Okay. This is just a slide of what one of those plantations would have looked like. These are people in Antigua. This is an image you can see the original at the West End Museum in Boston, which is a history of the communities that were there. When we talk about sweetness in Boston and the role of molasses, one important thing to remember is that most of the molasses that arrived in Boston was a trade good, and as a trade good, it was made into extremely cheap but powerful rum. There are a lot of comments at the time about how terrible the Boston rum was, but gosh darn it, it was cheap. It was a drink of the people, terrible but always available. When you're making sugar, that very desirable commodity, at the time, for every pound of sugar you made, you would have, every 3 pounds of sugar, you'd have about a pound of molasses, a pint as a byproduct. You had to do something with that. And it took about 4 or 5 gallons of molasses to make a gallon of rum. And pretty early on, our ingenious Yankee forefathers, whatever you want to call those people, you may not be related to them at all, figured out that it would make them a lot more money if they imported the rum from the Caribbean islands the molasses from the Caribbean islands and made it into rum up here and then shipped it off to Africa to buy humans than it was to ship up rum. So by 1770, there were 36 rum distilleries just in Boston. There were 51 in Massachusetts, and our colony produced 40% of all the rum in North America. Like, go Massachusetts! Wow. I'm not sure what else we contribute apart from Super Bowl wins to, America in that kind of proportion. We produce more than 2 million gallons of rum per year. On average, during the Revolutionary time, Americans consumed 3.5 to 4 gallons of pure alcohol per year per person. That it wasn't everybody. It's not like you had 2-year-olds going around with, a little tipsy bottle to drink from day to day. About 1/8 of the people in the United States drank about 2/3 of that. Okay, so there were some really heavy hitters who were drinking a lot. The equivalent of 7 shots of whiskey a day. And everybody else had a much lower support. There was a fair amount of alcohol ingestion around that time in the form of what's called small beer. And we'll see more about that in a slide or two. People would take the molasses home and make basically a soft drink out of it, which did have some alcoholic content. We're talking like 2, 3, 4, 5%, maybe. But they'd brew it at home and you would drink it the same way you drink Pepsi or Dr. Pepper or one of those other brown liquids that people drink today. But again, that was a drink. That wasn't something you were pouring on flapjacks every morning. It wasn't something you were smearing on bread all the time. It wasn't something you were putting on chicken and roasting if you had a chicken to roast. It was a drink, and it wasn't the central part of your diet. I'm just looking at this. Was there something else I was supposed to tell you? No, there was not. Let's go on to the next thing. Oh, this is Old North Church. And I like to put this up because it's a reminder to me of just how entwined the Boston economy was with molasses and rum and alcohol and the trade in humans at the time. If you go to Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, that Old North Church, on the wall, you will see a plaque devoted to a certain gentleman of Barbados, sort of a thank you to the donors. Of course, those gentlemen of Barbados were making their money by producing sugarcane, when they were doing that by using people who were enslaved to produce that sugarcane. At the time of the Revolution, I am going to have to talk about this on a different page because I can't find the statistic I wanted to share with you. So we will continue on. But it's hard to overstate just how much the question of sugar and production of sugar supported Boston in its revolutionary further. Next. Okay. So we're talking about some groups who don't have choice about what food they have, and we're talking about how we know what food they're fed. One other group that was important during the Revolutionary time was, of course, our soldiers who went and fought during the War of Independence. And I find it interesting to look at their rations versus what modern military rations look like in the United States. So you can see here, I just want to go over some of their items. Every day, the Massachusetts Provincial Council set the daily allowance of 1 pound of bread, 1/2 pound of beef, 1/2 pound of pork, or 1 day in 7, they shall have 1 pound and 1/4 of salt fish. There's your cod. Pint of milk, or if milk cannot be had, a gill of rice, which is an interesting substitution. I guess maybe they were making rice milk. I don't know. 1 pint of good spruce or malt beer. That's that small beer you're talking about. 1 gill of peas or beans or other sauce equivalent. Thing to remember with sauce. What is sauce? Is that ketchup? No, that's sort of a blanket term for vegetables. Vegetables were sauce. It's like something you sprinkle on your meat. It's not something you just eat because you want to. It's a little bit of flavor. Okay, 6 ounces of good butter. None of that bad butter. Betty bought her butt some butter, but she said her butter's, but no, none of that, just good butter. 1 pound of good common soap for 6 men per week. Keep it clean, guys. And 1/2 pint of vinegar per week per man, if it can be had. That last one is interesting because that was an attempt to prevent scurvy. Which of course is the lack of vitamin C, which leads to things like your teeth falling out, sores all over your body, and various other suffering. Vinegar is not a source of vitamin C. It has an acidic taste, which might make you think it will work, but it didn't. And there was a lot of suffering because this was a very, in some ways, non-nutritious menu for our military fighters. One other thing to be noted here when they talk about the salt fish, one of the big problems supplying the Continental Army is the problem of acquiring salt. because when you are cut off from European shipping, it's hard to get the salt to preserve your meat into the United States. We didn't have very good salt works here. A lot of the salt used to preserve things like sides of beef or pork was imported from Spain. So as long as the battles were happening near a large population center, it was easy to get meat to them because you could just drive them to farmer's field. But as they went farther south, where the temperature is higher, where it's harder to preserve meat just because of cold, there are some problems supplying those soldiers. Next slide. I am taking far too long with this. Okay, meals ready to eat. If you're out on the battlefield today, here's an example of what you'd eat. I just want to call your attention to the fact that there are 3 different sugary things in there that you can get. This meal 23, which I chose because it has the very American pepperoni pizza, which was not available to our Continental Army. You get cherry cobbler and 7 cookies and chocolate protein drink powder, which is basically sugar with some protein in it, and a spoon. Those poor Continental soldiers had to provide their own flatware. Oh, the suffering. But it's a very different menu today. Next slide. Okay, this is a dietary from 1912 in Lowell, Massachusetts. Remember when I talked about how social workers go and record what people eat? This is what people were eating when they were living in Lowell and working in the mills. A skilled weaver would have butter, again, cake, tea, potatoes, some vegetables, gingerbread for supper. The French Canadians would have bread and bread and bread. I mean, if you're eating on a budget, you get to buy bread. It's cheap. And they have gingerbread for breakfast instead of dinner. And I'm not sure why there's that switch. Might be a cultural thing. Next slide. Okay. One other side effect. Rich people eat differently from poor people. I like this because this is a denture made by Paul Revere. He advertised that he was cheaper than a dentist's surgeon. You could go and get dentures made by a silversmith instead of a doctor, which seems to have been cheaper at the time. If you were wealthy, you had more access to sugar in colonial times. And more access to sugar means your teeth rotted really fast. And you would go to Paul Revere and you could get your mouth repaired. But it also affects what people are choosing to eat. How many of you like a really crisp, crunchy apple? So you can bite into and crunch. Okay. If you had one of those in your mouth, that's not the apple you're going to choose. And if you look at lists of apples from colonial times before, you'll see praising for apples that are soft like marrow, like the stuff inside a bone. You may not like a squishy apple today that's basically applesauce in a skin, but if you have to go to a silversmith to get new teeth, that's a very attractive fruit. Next, please. Okay, here's the Hingham. Yay! Yes, this is the fireplace over in the house up the street. One other thing that affects how people taste things is how things are cooked. And there was a big transformation after the Revolutionary War when people went from using these open fireplaces, which are extremely wasteful. Most of the heat is going straight up the chimney and kind of hard to cook on. You can see that she has all those different hooks on there. To regulate how much heat your food is getting, you have to physically move it around. None of this, oh, I'm going to turn it up to like 7.5 and that'll be the perfect temperature for sauteing my green beans. No, you can't do that. You have to put it on hook. You move it to the fire, you move it back to the fire, you watch the fire, you see if the fire's getting high, if it's getting low, are the embers still going? Do you have to put in more wood? Do you have to take out some wood? It is a pain in the neck to cook on a wood fireplace. And it's hard to control the temperature when you're baking. If you go over to the house, you'll see they have a couple of different pots with 3 little legs on them. If it has a handle, it's called a spider, but those are standard baking vessels. If you're making something like a cornbread, you put it on those legs on the coals and you get a very strong heat coming up from the bottom. And if you're talented and you move it at the right time, you get a lovely cooked bread like you would if you're cooking on a fire if you're camping. And if you move it at a wrong time, it's burnt. And it's really easy to burn stuff on fireplaces. If you look at cookbooks published closer to 1800, you see a lot of recipes for things like puddings boiled in bags. You know why? Because when you're boiling water, it stays the same temperature. You can predict what's going to happen. If you're baking in an environment like this, it's much more difficult. It requires a lot more skill, something that not everybody can learn. And that is a patent stove that was sold in Boston around 1840. And look at that, it's all square. Nothing round about it. And there aren't any hooks. You can put things on top and you think it's going to stay about the same temperature. You can put something inside the baking box instead of having to put hot coals into a side bread baking area and scrape them out and hope it's the right temperature in the inside there. And it's much more predictable experience. Next, please. Okay. And you see this illustration. This is from a school book in about 1880, talking about a New England kitchen in the olden time. Next, please. And this is a fairly hard to see, but this is the New England kitchen featured in the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, where they showed what a New England kitchen looks like. During the Civil War and after Civil War, there was a big craze for presenting old-timey New England kitchens at things like church fairs. I saw a manual from Ohio saying, oh yes, we had a New England fair with Old Mammy's donuts and things like that, where they would have a menu of what they thought New England food ought to be and present it with, women in long skirts and bonnets and a little fireplace and somebody knitting in the corner who was usually called something like Aunt Hepzibah. Sort of like, you ever seen the Hillbilly Bears down in one of the Disney places? Sort of like that, but for New England. Next, please. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about sugar and how people were using a lot of sugar, but not eating a lot of it. And we've talked about how different people were eating different things during the colonial era and during the Revolutionary War. And we've talked a little bit about how people thought about the New England kitchen and trying to reproduce it 100 years later. Like, oh, we should remember what this kitchen looked like, but with a very limited menu, because when you're serving people at a big fair like the Centennial Exposition, you're basically limited to things like donuts, which is a large part of the New England diet, but not all the diet. I mean, you have to have the coffee with it too, right? Next, please. Okay. So when I started wondering about molasses, when did molasses come to baked beans? I read this story basically in a lot of different publications, which is the Indians pit cooked their beans in maple sugar and included a lump of bear fat. The New Englanders replaced the maple sugar with molasses, the bear fat with salt pork, and retained the basic principle of slow cooking. And this is problematical for a variety of different reasons. One of them, we already talked about how people really weren't using molasses in cooking very much. Then there's this whole matter of who these Indians are. Okay, who's an Indian? Who is that? Are you talking about a Narragansett tribesman, like maybe Mr. Canonicus that we talked about earlier? Are you talking about maybe Tisquantum from the Wampanoag? Are you talking about somebody from the Mi'kmaq? These stories about how baked beans came to be never say who it was who was doing this cooking this way. It's always just those people, which means they don't know. A woman named Sandra Oliver, who wrote a wonderful book called Saltwater Foodways about cooking on the seashore of Mystic, Connecticut in the 19th century, taught me the term fake lore. Around the time of the bicentennial year, and this may happen again because it's getting to be the 250th, there were all these cookbooks about one food from every state. And some states have a lot more food to choose from than others, just to be honest. I mean, like Texas, they've got chili, they've got tamales, they got all sorts of things. Massachusetts tended to end up with baked beans, and you tend to have this story in there. And I kept on wondering, is any part of this true? Next, please. Okay. I'm going to kind of show you a couple of slides with what I learned about baked beans, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because I took some information from cookbooks, and cookbooks are not necessarily what people were eating. Remember how I talked about you can see the diets of some people because we know what was bought for them, what supplies they had. Cookbooks are, think about Martha Stewart, okay? Do you cook like Martha Stewart every day? Do you cook like the cake boss? No, you do not, because you're a real person who lives in the real world. I mean, Martha Stewart is now, but she lives in a very different world. Cookbooks are sort of aspirational. They're what we would cook if we had time, what we would like to cook. But I refer to the peanut butter and jelly problem, okay? There is a recipe for peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in The Joy of Cooking. It does not take up 50% of the book, which is what it would if it reflected how often people eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Similarly, their macaroni and cheese section is rather slim. You can't tell what people are actually eating by cookbooks, but you get an idea of what they want and what they would like to cook. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. I actually sat down, I went to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, at Radcliffe, and got out a bunch of published cookbooks and community cookbooks over the past 100 years to say, okay, maybe I can trace down exactly when molasses went into beans. I had found information from 1825 from newspapers suggesting, oh, if you want to make your beans more savory, put a tablespoon of molasses in 2 quarts of beans. And anybody who's ever cooked beans, 2 quarts of beans is like that many beans once you actually soak them and things. So that's just a tiny little bit, basically just something that would make them look a little bit different. So I sat down and calculated for everything that was labeled Boston baked beans, how much sugar and how much molasses was in the recipe at a given time. And I found that, in 1880, the proportion of molasses to beans was pretty low, then went up to 1909, then we had a war, and it went up again. And then it kind of skyrocketed since 2000, where, about a third of the volume of your dish of beans is molasses or sugar, which means it's basically a dessert and you should put it on a cake. You could frost things with baked beans. Next, please. And this is sort of the natural end point of baked beans in the future, that they will be completely coated in sugar and we will all be very happy. Next, please. Okay. So out of this question of, who cooked their beans with maple sugar with a lump of bear fat, maple sugar, questionable. If there was so much maple sugar around, then maybe you wouldn't have been asking for 8 pounds of sugar as a special treat if you had all this maple sugar around. One of these facts is definitely true about early New England cooking and Native American cooking of the 17th century. Next, please. Everybody likes bear fat. There's lots of records of people cooking with bear fat. This is Holly. She won the Fat Bear Week contest for Katmai National Park in 2019. She's doing a great job, living her best bear life. Okay, next, please. This is a ruined gingerbread man. This is actually a character from a game called Fortnite. You can see he's burnt. He was left in the oven too long. I'm including him because when I was thinking about molasses, I was thinking about, okay, what other foods have a lot of molasses in the New England? And I looked at gingerbread. Gingerbread is something that's very common in New England cookbooks, starting with Amelia Simmons in 1796. There's recipes for gingerbread there. Fanny Farmer has 12 different types of gingerbread in the 1896 cookbook. And then it kind of disappears. The current Fanny Farmer cookbook has just 2 types of gingerbread and 14 different types of chocolate cakes, which may actually represent the proportion of time people eat chocolate cake in the United States, unlike her peanut butter and jelly section. What I found was that over the course of the 19th century, again, we started with a lot of sugar being used in recipes for gingerbread. And then after the Civil War, it started creeping up. And there was more molasses in each recipe. And there were fewer and fewer recipes that relied on sugar or other types of flavoring, and it became very, very molasses heavy. And my hypothesis is that's one reason people stopped eating gingerbread so much, because molasses is just not as tasty as sugar. Next, please. Okay. So this is Paul Revere reflecting on your teeth. Maybe you could use a little improvement out there. Why did the molasses increase in baked beans over the course of the 19th century? It seems like it wasn't actually there during colonial time, but people talk about it being historic. We see all these stories about early New Englanders basically adopting the recipe from Native Americans, adopting it as their own and putting molasses in. Why do we have this story about something that seems to have actually happened after the Civil War, when people were not consulting and having potlucks with the Wampanoag people very often? I hope they did, but and my answer is that molasses was seen as a colonial ingredient. We knew the molasses trade was very big. We had the entire Molasses Act in 1733, which helped spur the revolution 40 years later. Of course, that was largely about protecting the rum production in the Caribbean, because the British noticed that there were all these distilleries up in Boston, and they didn't like that the Boston people were making all the money. So they made big tariffs and taxes on molasses, starting a great American tradition of smuggling which continued through the Revolutionary War and helped us win many battles. So molasses identified with colonial time, with a time when Massachusetts was a center of business and industry. And around the bicentennial year, a lot of Massachusetts, New England had kind of an identity crisis because we weren't the center of the United States at that point. There was a lot of financial industry in New York. There was exciting stuff happening as people pushed west and found new land, went to California with a gold rush. There were so many possibilities, so many ways to make your fortune. Who was going to stay around in Boston, this old city with old ideas? But we had history. We had the New England fairs, which were promoting this identity of New England with things like molasses, with Indian pudding, with donuts, with beans with molasses in them around the United States. We had the colonial revival where people in New England were becoming more interested in colonial times and colonial ingredients. We had a lot of immigrants coming into New England starting in the 1880s, which really revived our region's economy, made us a very vibrant economic power. But also, these were different people. These were people that some of the longer time people were not entirely comfortable with. They felt like, I need to establish what my culture is. Very different from the situation in New York, where, knishes and bagels and pizza have been integrated as true New York food. We eat them in New England, but people don't necessarily think of pizza as being a New England food. And I have comments about New England pizza as someone who grew up in New Jersey. I can talk to you about that privately later. Yes, it's a different thing. It's called the same thing. It's just different. And I'm not going to go over scientism, but if anybody wants to talk about Ellen Swallow Richards and how home economics helped ruin New England food, I can talk about that later. Next, please. This is just a graphic of what immigration looked like in the United States in 1900. I like it because you can see over where Massachusetts is, just the concentration of people from different places, from Ireland, from Canada, from Italy, from Greece, from Armenia, coming and reviving and giving energy to our region. And it's not just Massachusetts, reaches up New Hampshire, those areas, coastal Maine, northern Vermont, where there are a lot of Canadians going back and forth over the borders. We're not a unitary society. We're a place that's made up of lots of people with lots of different culinary backgrounds and lots of different history. Next, please. Okay. So one of the points in my book is that when people talk about New England cuisine, there's a lot of hearkening back to what people thought colonial people were eating. But again, we don't have the same tongues. We don't have the same foods available. We can't eat the way that we did in colonial times in a lot of real ways. And what we think was colonial food isn't necessarily colonial food. We can enjoy it. We can think back to our history. We need to understand that we're looking back to a particular history. The people here who were enslaved in Antigua and brought to Boston to serve the families here may have had a very different experience if they were eating molasses than the people who were enslaving them. It may have tasted very bitter to them. I don't know. Nobody asked them. Okay, next one. And this is the last slide. Okay. Why do we have Boston baked beans at all? Why does anybody care? Because in 1907, there were 1 million stickers with this image on them sent off in newspapers all over America. This new medium, the sticker. Imagine growing up in a world without stickers. That stopped in 1907. There was a tradition of something called Old Home Days, where various cities in New England, Vermont, would advertise to everybody who had moved out to get more money in the West. And say, come home for your old home days. Remember grandma, remember your days of your youth. And this was an advertising campaign to get people to come to Boston, and it was chosen as the symbol of old-timey Boston, the beans, which were honestly had been associated with farmers back to 1825. I found a reference to, oh yes, the old peddler goes to the farm stand and eats baked beans, and a picnic in I think it was Farmington, Connecticut, where they said, we will have a table with the foods of our ancestors, including pumpkin pie and baked beans, as though it was something quaint that nobody actually ate anymore in the urban areas. So this was Boston. This was old-timey Boston being advertised. And next slide, please. You started getting postcards like this of the great spirit of Boston and her wheel of beaniness. It's kind of a mixed up kind of thing, but people liked it. Next one. You know, you got images of beans, baked beans. Let me see. I think the next one is the best one. Yeah, this is what made Boston Beantown. Hundreds of postcards saying you don't know beans until you come to Boston. And there's the Custom House, which I primarily know is the place where the peregrine falcons nest in Boston. They like the really high things like. So these postcards were sent all over the country. And when people saw these images of beans, I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to Boston. I got to try some beans. Sure, let's do that. And we are left with this legacy of one of the more successful advertising campaigns in the history of New England. You know, it's captured more imaginations than the Brownies Polar Bear Swim. Maybe less controversy than Tom Brady and his magical shrinking footballs. And we are left with this legacy, with these beans with the sugar put in them that taste as sweet as candy. And that's what I leave to you to think about. What do we know about the past? What makes you happy to eat? And I'm happy to take questions. I'm sorry I went on so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meg. For those who have to leave now, we ask if you do so, please do quietly. And anyone have any questions for Meg, either here or at our at-home audience? Looks like we have one online. I'll let Judith take it.
Both my grandmother and great aunt, both born in the late 19th century, often served molasses cookies or molasses gingerbread to us mid 20th century.
Yum.
There wasn't much sugar in the recipe. Comment, is that old times Boston or reflective of sweet taste?
Why not both? The price for sugar went down a lot between 1800 and 1900, and the price of molasses went down too. Basically, when tariffs were removed from foreign sugar after the Civil War, it became really cheap. And you can see this in the Fannie Farmer cookbook. She has, oh my God, the recipes she has for things like marshmallow on bananas are just crazy and very tasty, I'm sure. So people like sugar, I say. All right.
Annie, we got one.
Yes, ma'am.
Hold on, Joe.
There were no native bees.
There were native bees. There weren't any native honeybees.
Honeybees.
Yeah, the ones that would go and make a hive and put honey there. There were plenty of mason bees, not mason bees. I keep on saying that. Carpenter bees is what I mean. We don't have bees that burrow into rock. Yeah, there are lots of, all the things that we call native pollinators were here, and plants were fertilized. Yeah, or else they'd all be glass flowers like we had at Harbin. So,
Any other questions? We got another one online.
Could you comment on the Great Molasses Flood?
oh yeah, yeah, oh yeah. Okay, so first of all, if you really want to know a lot about the molasses flood, read Stephen Palillo's book, Dark Tide. It's an excellent book. So the thing about the molasses flood, okay, this happened in 1919. It's the eve of Prohibition, okay? So the people importing molasses are trying to get as much in as quickly as possible to make as much rum as possible before it becomes illegal. That's one factor. The tank was built at the edge of the North End. This is where the poor folks live, okay? This is at the edge of where all the Italian immigrants, all the poor immigrants in Boston come in when they first get off the boat. It's in a residential neighborhood. It is a shoddily built tank. All right. Before it exploded, you know, they had rivets popping out and kids would come up with pitchers and get some of the molasses that was coming out. It was terrible. And it was an environmental disaster. When it did explode that January day, you had molasses coming out at a speed of 40 miles an hour out of that tank. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's a horrible way to die because you've got this thick, sticky liquid you can't breathe and it just comes over. You've seen pictures of the elevated train being smashed down and the trains coming off their tracks because of this giant wave. And it led to a lot of revisions of building codes in Boston and around the nation. It was an environmental justice disaster, and it struck a very poor neighborhood, and it's a tragedy. And a waste of a lot of good molasses, which was also used to make munitions. Okay, this was industrial molasses. It was used to make rum, but it was also used to make industrial alcohol, to make weapons, So yeah, bad scene, man. Bad scene. I'd much rather have some Joe Froggers, than
Yeah. Oh, does anyone else make Joe Froggers? I make Joe Froggers all the time.
great.
It's a molasses cookie.
Yes.
But I just find it interesting. Long ago, when the Big E was known as the Eastern States Exposition, I'm talking in the 50s, and they still have the states buildings. The only one that had anything to do with beans was Maine, and they would give out little bean pots with beans. The Bushes, I think Bushes still are in Portland. So the manufacturer was not here. The manufacturer was up in Maine.
Okay, so you're giving me occasion to say something I didn't actually say in my talk, which I meant to include, but about Maine and beans and baked beans. Okay, Sandra Oliver, very smart food historian. I talked with her about this at one point. She claimed that the reason that people started having sweet beans had to do with industrial canning. Okay, so Civil War, you start getting a lot of canning coming to provide troops, you get a lot of advances, so you don't actually die when you eat canned food, like it doesn't just spoil in there. And the main companies start wanting to grow crops and can things. And there's a lot of mood for standardized sizes of food among main canneries. Like, they like blueberries because they're all ripe at the same time. They're all about the same size. They decide to can beans, but a lot of people, when they're eating beans, we get like backyard beans. They could be brown, they could be yellow, and lots of different varieties out there. They wanted something that was the same size. They could predict how they could cook it, how long it would take, how much fuel it would take. And they decided on these little white pea beans, the navy beans. You've seen them. These were what was being canned in the late 19th century. Problem is that they're not brown, so they look like they're cooked if you just pour them out of a can. And of course, they didn't bake their beans. Bushes doesn't bake their beans. They put them in a big pot and they boil them. They're boiled beans. They had that problem too. And the solution was to put molasses in to color it. And people got used to the taste of those sweet beans. And Sandra Oliver actually has a letter from a man saying, "Oh, how much I enjoy those sweet beans," writing home to his mother from very far away. So it's partly their fault. Or maybe we should take joy in their innovation of adding more molasses to make it look like it was a home-cooked bean when it wasn't. Thank you.
We do.
Yeah.
Eileen is asking, did people only make their own sweets in colonial times? And when did bakeries become popular here?
Oh, that's a good question. So baking bread when you don't have a modern oven, with an electrical element or heat or gas coming in, it's a royal pain because you have to get it hot enough to bake bread, which is usually 450, 500 degrees. You have to put in hot coals and take it out. A lot of people didn't have an oven like that in their house. If you're living in the city, you didn't have an oven like that, if you especially lived on the second floor necessarily. A lot of people would just take their bread to the bakers. There were bread bakers starting very early in Boston. I'm trying to think. There were bread riots going on by 1730, so it would have been before there. Anytime you had a city, you would have a baker who was turning out breads and sweets and things like that. Trying to remember, by 1800, there was a guy in Harvard Square who was really well known for cheesecake. There was a woman named Duchess Quamino who lived in Rhode Island in the 1760s, who bought her freedom. She was enslaved by making fruit cakes and selling to the gentry. And apparently they were excellent. Plum cakes, they were called at the time. So there were people definitely making sweets professionally by the colonial era. They were definitely, if they were in Providence, they were in Boston as well. I don't have much more specifics for you about that, and I'm sorry. But they were out there. People love sugar. They'll buy it anytime.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yes,
Let's
thank you
have
for your
another
patience, everyone.
sponsor, Meg. Thank you so much for joining us. All are invited to the museum shop on the first floor. We had a rush at the beginning of the lecture, so I think, Carol, we have one more. Nope, sorry, we are sold out of Meg's books. But if you want a chance to meet the author and enjoy some refreshments with us, please join us on the first floor of the museum. And we'll see you all in January. Happy holidays. Thanks.